When an economy breaks, it rarely happens all at once. Usually, it looks like a perfectly solid surface right up until the hidden pressure underneath finally causes it to give way. Right now, the popular narrative blames inflation on recent global conflicts. It's an easy cause and effect story to follow. But while those conflicts are only 5 months old, the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation has been missing its target for over 5 years. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually use the headline inflation numbers to track prices. They target a 2% inflation rate measured specifically by personal consumption expenditures, or the PCE. This is the scoreboard that counts. The flat line represents the 2% target, yet the actual data has stayed elevated for 63 consecutive months. The PCE currently sits at more than double the Fed's target and is continuing to climb. For 23 years, during a period called the Great Moderation, growth was steady and inflation reliably hovered around that 2% mark. It looked like the economy was regulating itself. When the data deviates this far for this long, it suggests the Federal Reserve is facing a structural problem that their traditional tools were never designed to handle. In the late 1970s, inflation was sprinting at over 13.5%. To stop the dollar from rotting, Fed Chair Paul Volcker drove interest rates to 20%, deliberately triggering 2 back-to-back recessions. Volcker's move worked because it executed a single clean function. By strangling the money supply, he slammed the brakes on borrowing until inflation had nothing left to feed on. Volcker had a specific advantage. The country could absorb the damage. When he took office, the national debt was only a quarter of the size of the total economy. Raising rates successfully slammed the brakes because the government's debt was manageable. Today, that debt has expanded to reach a 1-to-1 match with the entire American economy. With the national debt now sitting at 100% of GDP, the basic mechanics of a Federal Reserve rate hike have fundamentally changed. On one hand, the intended effect remains. Higher rates act as a brake, making loans pricier and slowing down the economy. But underneath that brake is a hidden pedal. Because the debt is so large, higher rates force the government to pay significantly more interest on what it already owes, effectively pressing down on the gas. Net interest on the debt is now running around $1 trillion a year. That bill is larger than the entire military budget and consumes 19% of every dollar the federal government collects. $1 trillion in interest payments flows out to the pension funds, banks, and investors who lent the government money. That cash is then spent, lent out, or reinvested back into the system at these new, higher rates. This creates a paradox. The same move meant to pull money out of the economy to cool it down is now responsible for pumping $1 trillion back into it. Economists track this flow of cash using a metric called M2, which measures the total amount of money sloshing around the financial system. In 2020, the Federal Reserve flooded the system by creating money out of thin air to buy bonds, a policy called quantitative easing. Their balance sheet more than doubled in just 2 years, eventually sending inflation to a 40-year high. To fight that inflation, the Fed tried to drain the system starting in 2022. They took over $2 trillion off their balance sheet, causing the American money supply to shrink for the first time since the Great Depression. That tightening reached a breaking point last year. On December 1st, the Fed announced the draining was over, and just 11 days later, they began buying bonds again to inject cash back into a straining financial system. The Federal Reserve is structurally trapped. They cannot permanently defeat inflation if the basic maintenance of the financial system forces them to continually replenish the money supply. The lawmakers who create the national debt are the primary drivers of this structural cycle. The United States has run continuous structural deficits for a quarter of a century straight. Current spending sits at nearly 6% of the entire economy, far above historical averages. This creates a mathematically unsustainable loop. Borrowing leads to more interest, which in turn requires even more borrowing to cover the bill. The American electoral system drives this cycle by rewarding politicians who promise to spend more. There is no political incentive for austerity, so the national deficit has exceeded 3% of GDP for almost the entire 21st century. To address this incentive problem, Warren Buffett proposed a drastic thought experiment to hold lawmakers directly accountable for the deficit. He suggested a law stating that any time the national deficit exceeds 3% of GDP, all sitting members of Congress become ineligible for re-election. While we Arians, until the political incentives that reward endless borrowing are changed, the cycle of debt and inflation cannot be solved.